Thank you, Roselle. Thank you all for being here. It's really a pleasure. We launched this series of going to different boards of trades and chambers of commerce across the country a month ago, and trust me, there's been a lot happening since then. So we went to Montreal, to Halifax, to Vancouver, and of course, last but not least, beautiful Toronto. And I will, of course, answer your question, Roselle, and I know many of you will have questions, but I just wanted to give you 2 points, mainly before starting this fireside chat. First, as we all know, the U.S. launched a trade war against us yesterday, and we came up with a very strong retaliation plan, which was $155 billion worth of tariffs. And we did that in the context of making clear that we would never negotiate against ourselves, and we would never be in a weak position. And so while conversations are happening, and I'll be able to answer questions today about that, and things are very, very fluid, I want you to know that we have your back. And the Canadian government is here to defend every single job in this country. And that's something I take very, very, very much at heart, and I completely understand what is at stake. Secondly, this is happening at a time where the geopolitical tectonic plates are moving very quickly. And so it is, yes, this trade war that is happening, but it's just overall geopolitical uncertainty. And I will be hosting the foreign ministers in Canada next week, in Quebec, in the Charlevoix region. For the first time, a member of the Trump administration will be coming to Canada. So Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, will be coming to Canada, along with all the foreign ministers of the G7. And of course, our goal is to make sure that there is strong G7 unity. And why do I mention that? Is I know that being a former business person, you can't take decisions when there's so many risks, because you're dealing with risk every day and you're trying to assess it, and based on that, you take your decisions. But we're now in a world where you can not only assess economic risks, you have to assess political and geopolitical risk at the same time. And this is the first time as a generation we're actually dealing with this. Our grandparents had to. But now also this is creating an opportunity for Canada to be strong at home. And of course, I look forward to answering your questions and hearing your thoughts about this, because we won't let this crisis go to waste. We will reinforce ourselves, and we'll make sure that Canada is strong and proud. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. For my microphone, is this on? Perfect, great. Thank you so much, Minister. We have, I would say, just to use the war analogy for a minute, Minister, I think we're fighting two battles, I would say. The first battle is obviously the response to the tariffs. It's what I call the gushing blood issue. And we have to respond, and we understand that. But the other battle, I would say, is that uncertainty that you referenced, and the implications that has on businesses and decisions. And how do we keep ourselves, how do we survive the next 4 years of what might be a President Trump era? And keep us competitive, keep businesses here, keep investment here, et cetera. So you're going to hear, I'm going to ask some table setting questions, and then I'm going to turn to the audience. Minister, you're going to hear from a lot of CEOs, C-suite leaders here today from various sectors. And these are members of our Business Council of Toronto. And these are CEOs and leaders that want to lean in. They're not here to look for handouts from government, but they are trying to do their part, and they need to rally around and determine what we need to do and use whatever levers you can give us to accomplish that. So with that, everyone, I will start with the first question is, as Minister of Foreign Affairs, you play a central role in engaging key leaders in Washington. Minister, can you just tell us, hum a few bars about those engagements with Trump administration officials in Washington, their goals? How do we respond to that?
So, of course, there are different levels of engagement. And for my part, I've been 5 times to Washington and Mar-a-Lago. And the key negotiation team for the Trudeau government right now is, of course, the Prime Minister himself, but it's also Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Finance, and the work he's doing also on with Howard Lutnick, and for myself, what I'm doing with Secretary Rubio, and I've been engaging also with others, including the Minister of Public Safety, Minister of Immigration with Tom Homan, the border czar, the NSA, Mike Walsh, etc., etc. So we need to bear in mind that there are 3 executive orders right now that are affecting us. And I want you to bear that in mind because that's how Washington thinks. The first one is everything that is linked to the border issue. And that's the one that prompted the trade war to start. And when President Trump acts, he needs to have the powers under his own, the American Constitution. Because technically, trade is under the legislative branch, is under Congress. So he needs to say that there is a security crisis in order for him to say, I'm using tariffs to defend my country against a security crisis. Hence, that argument about the issue of fentanyl at the border, which we think is a bogus argument. Why? Because first, less than 1% of fentanyl comes from Canada. Second, less than 1% of illegal migrants going to the US come from Canada. That doesn't mean that we can't do more to secure a border. That's what we did, guys. We spent $1.3 billion just on the border. We launched a joint strike force to address fentanyl. We made sure also that there were more boots on the ground, the right technology at the border. We sent videos, clips, pictures of everything we were doing at the border. And we're getting positive feedback from the American people, the American security forces, border forces that are working every day with the RCMP and the CBSA. So we know that that work is important because obviously the US is a net exporter of illegal guns, illegal drugs, and also of illegal migrants to Canada, so we have to do it for us. But meanwhile, we're making sure that we give a win to the Trump administration. But notwithstanding all of that, they still decided to take the decision of launch a trade war. Meanwhile, there's a second executive order, which is also important, that is targeted to all the countries that are exporting steel and aluminum. And that is coming into force on March 12th, so next week. This is a new executive order, but we've seen that under the Trump administration 1.0 at the time. And it was also in place during the Biden administration, but the European Union and ourselves had an exemption. So now, no exemption for Canada, no exemption for anyone, steel and aluminum tariffs. 70%, so the US really, really needs our steel. A lot of American companies are actually owners of steel plants here in Canada, and they definitely also need our aluminum. So this will have an impact on the cost of housing in the US. I'll get back to that. March 12th, so that's the second executive order. And the third executive order is the one that was signed by President Trump on Inauguration Day on January 20th, and it is to study the relationship that the US has with every single of its trading partners. And when you hear from the Trump administration reciprocal tariffs, that's the executive order. Okay. And it's coming in force on April 1st. And the Trump administration wants to do a deal with all its trading partners, and notwithstanding whether the trade agreements are coming up for renegotiation or not. So, and when they negotiate with us, they put everything on the table. They don't only talk about trade. They talk about military cooperation. They talk about the border. They can be talking about security, intelligence, and the Five Eyes. They can be talking about many, many, many different things. So So technically, how we're organized, and every single country is usually organized like that, we have trade teams that are ready. But now we have to be ready for everything, because we could be talking about water cooperation in the Great Lakes while talking about tariffs. So it creates a lot of unpredictability, I understand that, and I've said that many times. We have to be ready for the unpredictability and the chaos coming out of the Oval Office, and we need to fight back. And my message when I'm in Washington, Roselle, is we have not only a lot of arguments and a lot of allies in Washington, but we are stronger than some of us may think. Why? Because we're the biggest trading partner of the US. So when we use our purchasing power and our people decide to stop buying American or just buy Canadian or change their vacation plan, we're really having an impact on key districts and key states back in the US that creates political pressure back to Washington. We buy more than China, Japan, the UK, and France. We're the biggest client of the United States. And so the only way that the Trump administration will change course, and I want this to be extremely clear, none of us will change the opinion of President Trump, but it's the American people themselves. So our job collectively is to make sure that the American people are convinced that these tariffs are a tax on them, that they will pay more at the pump, that they will pay more at the grocery store, that they will pay more to buy a new house. These are the arguments we have. And if you look at the polls right now, the polls are showing that we're winning that communications battle, because that's a battlefield that we need to bear in mind. And that's the one that I must say must be the most important when dealing with President Trump. He's also looking obviously at the stock market, and we've seen what the stock market has been doing. And he's also looking at the price at the pump. So, and if there's a country that understands the most the Americans on the face of this planet, it's us. And when I was just in Europe, and I can answer that question also, Roselle,
yes.
I was explaining to my European colleagues what was going on in the US. And now they're catching up to where we are. But I can go into that.
Okay. Just a good segue to what you mentioned, Minister, is what should businesses across Canada expect from the Trump administration in terms of CUSMA renegotiations? You know, is there any terms or anything that can be done to escalate that?
So don't think that we haven't had conversation about saying, hey, let's reopen NAFTA, CUSMA. But the problem we've had is it's not clear what the American president wants. So it's not as if we're not saying it's, yes, let's talk about trade. But I've had conversations with colleagues in Washington saying, okay, but at the end of the day, what do you guys want? And I got the answer, we're about to know. There's one decision maker in the system. He's the only one to know. And so we need to be able to address that reality. And meanwhile, while we may be talking about trade, we have to think about anything else that we could also look into to make sure that there is cooperation. I just had a phone call with Marco Rubio, and the Prime Minister had a phone call with President Trump, and Dominic LeBlanc had a phone call with Howard Lutnick. The negotiations are continuing. But as mentioned, at the end of the day, only President Trump and Prime Minister Trudeau will get to a deal. And that's not only because it's us. It's like that for every single country. And that's what I said to my colleagues as well. When Prime Minister Modi goes to Washington and from India and he learns that India is being imposed tariffs during the context of his state visit, that's just a reality that may happen to others. Yeah. So that's an example. I could go on with many other examples. So that's it. We have lines of communications. There are negotiations happening, but let me be frank. We will never negotiate against ourselves. And we won't get through another psychodrama every 30 days. Because we know that this drives uncertainty, and uncertainty is obviously allergic to any form of investment. So we need to find a way to get to predictability to reduce risk of doing business in Canada.
Right. Thank you so much. I have a few other questions, but I'm actually going to do this a bit of curation way. So I'm going to turn to some of the business leaders here. Yeah. Michael McCain, if you don't mind, sir, may I start with you?
Sure. Good to see you, Michael. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. Nice to see you. Mm-hmm. So a little bit of a broad question, Minister. First of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you're doing. Being in the front line of something like this is always stressful and challenging. I appreciate your declaration that the motivations of the administration are unclear. Mm-hmm. The one thing we know is it's not a drug issue or a border issue. It's something else, and there's all the way from. I wouldn't call it negotiating because you can't describe extortion as negotiating all the way through to something that's geopolitical. But here, my question or combination of question or thought would be this. This is a war. I think any war we need to always acknowledge our pride in our country in the first instance, and secondly, that any war people get bloodied, and there will be Canadians negatively impacted by this, but it's a war nonetheless. We're fighting for our economic security, as you know, for our sovereignty. In fact, we're fighting for our respect as a nation. It's been the talk is always, we're going to fight to win. I think your government could be clearer for Canadians as to what a win means, and is what really does a win mean. And I think there's probably two dimensions of that win. The first is trying to talk this idiot bastard off the ledge and get him to back down. That would be certainly one win. And the other, though, I think is even more important. There's an old saying that I've leaned on in my life, which is that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And at the end of the day, there's also the better path probably is not that we talk him off the ledge, which is probably unlikely given his isolationist theories, thinking. But how do we create a stronger Canada out of this? And how do we create a stronger Canada? So my question really is on the first dimension of the win. I don't think we're going to accomplish that until we're really clear across the country that we are willing to use every arrow in the quiver in the fight, including our energy, right? And getting all Canadians coast to coast to think that way has been a challenge. I'd love to get your perspective on how we accomplish that. But I do believe that we can talk them off the ledge, but only if we're able to accomplish that. So what do you think could be done that would really be able to meet that goal? And then secondarily, in terms of creating a better future for our country, your government, for right or wrong, has been very focused on many things other than economic prosperity. I think I'm not being critical, just kind of facing the truth. And I think today a really bold pivot to a really clear, simplified agenda around economic prosperity to lead us to the promised land of a better future away from the United States, actually diversifying from the United States in any number of our economic obstacles would be really prudent and really fast. So what might those be?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, these are big questions. Actually, they're chapters of a book. It's okay. Okay, so first and foremost, how will we win? We will win only if we're united, because we know the U.S. is divided. And we know they're particularly divided on this issue of tariffs. And we know that many states that are Republican states don't agree with the tariffs. And the Democrats know also that the tariffs may be a way for them to get back in the game in terms of having a message that is resonating more with Americans. That's what we're hearing. This is just a fact. And so, based on that, we need to find a way to stay united, including on energy, including on things that technically have divided us sometimes, somehow. But now it's our entire economy. It's all the jobs across the country that are at stake, Michael. It's not one job more in Atlantic Canada, where you're from, or here, or in Alberta. It's all important. Just to give you an example, we send, the U.S. is relying on our uranium for 95% of their consumption. That is fundamental to all the nuclear sites that are powering many home heating systems across Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, etc. There is over-reliance also on hydro in Ontario and in Quebec. The entire Northeast grid is linked to Ontario and Quebec. Fertilizers, $1.7 billion more that it would cost in terms of if we would put tariffs, export tariffs on potash for farmers in the U.S., which they all rely on Saskatchewan potash. And of course, there's oil and gas. Mm-hmm. We haven't put that on the table yet, guys. We kept that in our game, in our cards, as cards that we could potentially play if this would escalate. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. knows that. So that's why $155 billion worth of tariffs is of American merchandise coming to Canada. But in order for us to be using any other new cards, we need to make sure that Canadians are on board and that premiers are on board. And I think that we've seen bit by bit even more unity coming out of the Council of Premiers, which is important. And I think that the future Prime Minister that will be elected over the weekend will have to put that as a clear priority. Because, of course, we are in this for a long run. I'm not saying necessarily the trade war, but the unpredictability coming out of the White House. And, President Trump is duly elected. He's a legitimate democratic leader, and he's elected for the next 4 years. In terms of, reinforcing our economy, that's why I said we won't let a good crisis go to waste. Mm-hmm. Canada was created, founded, based on the fact that we didn't want to be the U.S. And even my folks in my own province at the time decided to choose to do this partnership with, basically English Canadians, and to make sure that we would create this country. This is the partnership between John A. Macdonald and Georges-Étienne Cartier. That's what happened 150 years ago. It's in our DNA. It's in our history. And of course, at the time, we were also a dominion of the UK, of Great Britain. We have to become closer and make sure that we don't only think north-south, we think east-west. This is how our country was built. And we need to have the right infrastructures across the country to make sure that that's the case. This is an opportunity to create growth, to make sure that there's no internal barriers between provinces and territories. So that's also why we need stronger unity. And at the same time, we need to make sure that we create that growth and that real free trade amongst ourselves. Only that would be able to mend a huge part of the gap that is created by the tariffs in the US. And then we need to diversify, and we need to make sure that we look at other countries. The UK is an obvious one. Why? Because the UK, after Brexit, needs to be also closer to different countries. And we're an obvious choice, but also we should be closer to the EU. We have a free trade agreement with the EU. We also have, we're very close to South Korea and Japan. So all the G7, that's worth it. And I could go on and on and on. But just to give you a bit of context of what I went through 2 weeks ago, well, last week, I did an entire tour of the European capitals. Mm-hmm. So I went to Paris to meet with the French. I went to Germany, also at the Munich Security Conference. I went to Brussels to meet with the EU leaders, and also to London. And meanwhile, I went to South Africa for the G20.
Yeah.
That just was not on the way, but basically, why not? Based on that, what happened is I was amazed how much I was explaining to my colleagues what was going on in the US and how much they hadn't absorbed what was coming out of the White House. And they were surprised about the analysis I was giving, but also I realized how much we live in a North American context, and they don't. And so our job is to explain to them what's going on, because we're the canary in the coal mine, and they're next. And indeed, this week, when President Trump said 25% tariffs against the EU, I wrote to them, I told you.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying that now, and obviously also what happened on Ukraine, we're getting closer and closer to the Europeans, and as we should. But now, I can do the job, and the Prime Minister can do the job, and the future Prime Minister can do the job, but what fundamentally needs to happen, Roselle, is to make sure that you guys go and do business with Europe. And that we create these pathways to make sure that ultimately you're able to do more business with the UK and with Europe. And that flow of business needs to be able to happen as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jean-Marc, President and CEO of Honda Canada.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
Hi, Jean-Marc.
My question has to do with what you just talked about, is the opportunity that's open to Canadian businesses to do business with those we have trade agreements with.
Yeah.
And I heard the Prime Minister a few weeks ago talking about those, so we're not fully taking advantage of those. Why? Because it's easy to deal with the U.S.
Yeah.
Obviously, that's something that we need to explore more aggressively. But I'm just wondering, what is the percentage of business, if you will, U.S. versus other parts of the world in terms overall? What is that opportunity? What does it represent?
I don't have the latest number, but it's pretty much 75% of our trade is with the U.S. and 25% with the rest of the world. And that could vary. I think at one point it was 78, and it lowered. It went down to 70, but there is an over-reliance. And guys, we can't change our geography, so we'll continue to do business with the U.S. Just saying we have to diversify to create that market internally, to diversify with other also countries. And at the same time, we need to find a way that we have predictability in our relationship with the U.S. It's enough. It can't continue every 30 days. So that's really, really important. And that's why we won't negotiate against ourselves. We will use the cards that I was saying as ways to negotiate. And at the same time, the president won his elections based on two topics: immigration and cost of living, affordability. And this one, we're winning the hearts and minds of Americans. And when Prime Minister Trudeau made his speech, when was it? Yesterday? Yeah, yesterday. He was live on CNN. He was live on Fox News. People are listening. And they know him south of the border. Not saying everybody, is extremely political, but they know him more than other leaders in the world. And so they listen when he talks. And he's an Anglo-Saxon also. He speaks. And he's able to, talk the same type of language and the same type of North American reality. So that's why I'm just saying it is normal that we're worried, it is normal that we're anxious, but actually the strategy is working. Because it is through political pressure that we will be able to push back against this aggression.
Minister, just pulling on that thread, it's a perfect segue before I go back to the audience.
Yeah.
How is the federal government approaching supports for businesses and workers across the country should tariffs continue or this threat of tariffs continue for an extended period of time?
Well, of course, we've worked on different EI options, and we're working with businesses on that too. There will be a new Prime Minister, and that Prime Minister will definitely have a plan for the economy, and we'll see. I think that Canadians will want to decide what type of future they want, particularly on the economic front. But I really, really want to stress this, that I think, for me, the question of our economic future is extremely important. We're in this very important moment where it is not only doing a deal with the U.S., we need to have a very strong economic industrial strategy at home, and it would be a pleasure for me to be able to work with all of you on that.
Oh, thank you. Now, Minister, you mentioned oil and gas.
Yep.
Michelle Herodens, President of Enbridge Gas. Turn to you.
Thank you, Minister, for coming here today. And yes, I represent Enbridge, and we are a very proud Canadian company. It's 70 years that we started moving that Canadian crude oil to the U.S. and incredibly integrated, and that's really reflective of energy in North America. And I think that would be my feedback. I mean, I've been fortunate in the 25 years that I've been working to work from the Alberta oil sands to the refineries in Sarnia, and now I lead our gas distribution business. 4 million homes and businesses here in Ontario that we keep warm and safe with natural gas, and 3 million in the U.S. that we do the same thing for. And I think it's really important to recognize how integrated the system is, but also to recognize that it's not just Canada that's an energy superpower. In fact, I would say in the last decade that Canada's position has eroded significantly, and the U.S. is an energy superpower. And when we look at it as quite frankly, a company that's in every Canadian's pension plan, and we're taking care of what we need to do for our shareholders. I can also tell you that of the last $30 billion that we've invested, 29 has been in the United States, because we have the certainty and the clarity that we need for our shareholders in order that they'll get that return on their investment. I always describe my mother-in-law. She's over 100 years old, lives in Saskatchewan. She counts on that dividend that we bring her every quarter. So my question for you is, I agree, we have an energy emergency here. We have, war is not a bad word for what we're describing here, but what are we going to do to provide that long-term certainty for businesses to invest in Canada and to actually build out what we need? We need that infrastructure, whether it's pipelines or ports. It has to happen.
I agree with you. We need the right infrastructure. I was just at the Vancouver port 3 days ago. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up with the timeline. It's too much travel. And to make sure that there was not an issue with fentanyl at the port, etc., meeting with the port authorities in line with our border plan. But also, we need to continue to be even more competitive at our different ports because we are indeed competing with, for example, the LA port, Los Angeles port, or on the East Coast. So I agree with that. I think as for energy infrastructure, I think it's a fair conversation to have with Canadians. including with my folks back in my beautiful Belle Province. And I think that there is a reckoning now that we cannot be over-reliant on the U.S. And trust me, I understand how the different energy infrastructure is organized. I get it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, you don't have to ask a question if I call on you, okay? But Cyrus, would you like to ask a question, my dear Cyrus? Cyrus Madden?
Cyrus Madden.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for being here today.
A pleasure, sir.
I'm just curious, what do you think the EU how far would they go to support us in what's going on?
The EU, okay, couple of thoughts. I can't talk for President Trump, but I can only note that he hasn't met personally with the EU president, nor has the Secretary of State has met with the equivalent of the foreign minister of the EU. I think that a lot of the CEOs from the tech companies around President Trump have different views regarding the EU. The EU is one of the only organizations in the Western world that is trying to put regulations on addressing online harm, trying to find antitrust issues that are linked to different companies, the social media companies. And so I'm following very closely what's the relationship between the EU and the US. And I'm very preoccupied. President Trump also mentioned that the EU was created to, I don't remember what was the verb there, but to, basically get on the nerves of the US. Having done my master's degree at Oxford at the time when the UK was still part of the EU, in European law, the EU was created to make sure that there was not be a Third World War. And it was a steel and aluminum pact between France and Germany at the time, and it grew from there. Now, the EU is not, it doesn't, how can I say? You can't put political pressure on the EU the same way you can on their capitals. Because, and I think that President Trump wants to talk more to the different European capitals rather than the EU, to reinforce different countries rather than reinforcing the EU. And that's a clear conversation I had also with my European colleagues. We're there to reinforce the EU and to reinforce our European colleagues and to also reinforce the UK. We can do both. We don't see that as a problem. But what Europeans are really scared about right now is a threat coming from Russia. And when you're hearing them having strong leadership on Ukraine, they're actually talking about their own security and their own security guarantees against Russia. And we may be having threats coming from Russia and China in our Arctic, and we are also very concerned about what's going on with China on the Pacific side. And that, in their own geographical reality, is less of an issue, China. So when the US changes its own narrative on Ukraine, it is actually changing its own narrative regarding Russia. And therefore, the big question in the European Union and in Europe in general is, are we safe? And that's a fair question. Yeah. And so don't think that Ukraine is not linked to what is going on in the rest of the world. It's all connected. Before what was happening with the Trump administration and this trade war, we were already saying that Russia was working with North Korea against Ukraine, basically fighting together against Ukrainians, enabled by drones and equipment coming from Iran, and also supported economically through China. That was the axis. And we were working together to make sure we were putting sanctions, etc., supporting Ukraine, etc. But meanwhile, when I understand we want to stop the war in Ukraine, but at what cost? And how much can President Putin just decide to leave, rearm, and reinvade Ukraine? But more than that, invade part of NATO territory, which is Europe. And if that's the case, then it's a NATO crisis and we're involved, etc. So that's the relationship between the US and the EU. Thank you. I'm sorry if I wasn't able to do a short answer.
No, that's a good question though, Cyrus. Jana, I have a few other hands here, but Jana, please go ahead.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for being here today. Jana Mosley with Toronto Hydro. So a couple things from the electrical industry that I just wanted to make sure were top of mind, and then I do have a question for you. So I believe we've been working through Electricity Canada and just helping the government understand some of the intricacies of electricity, and certainly it being such an essential service for Canadians and for Americans. It is a delicate balance. And we just want to thank you and your government for listening and continuing to listen, because it's incredibly important that we're able to continue to have access to essential equipment and materials that come either from the United States and or internationally, and we need to continue to invest in opportunities there to look internationally for those trade agreements. One of the things that I think we wanted to make sure is top of mind, though, is also that ability to move skilled labor between the borders. And we saw that just the way Canadians even supported Americans last year through hurricane season. And I think that is, leverage that we do have, and it tends to be support that's going that way these days. But I wanted to leave you with just another thing, and that's around cybersecurity. And I think that in times like this, when you think of the geopolitical challenges that we're seeing, we continue to see challenges in infrastructure companies around cyber. And one of the things that, is top of mind for us as leaders is that we don't become too preoccupied with other things, and somehow we miss the big one. And I'm sure that people are thinking that we are more volatile than in the past. And so I leave you with that. But my question for you is, what can we be doing as a business community to better support you and make sure that you are getting the timely information that you need? Because we all know some of these decisions get made in a back room late at night. And we want to make sure, I think, as business leaders, that you truly do have the information that you need. And then the second thing I just encourage you and your team on is to make sure we're really hearing real time what it is you are thinking. Because I think what we heard today were a lot of excellent concepts, but for us to be out there selling the message and supporting where we want to go together in unity, we need to feel like we truly are taking some big, bold moves and we're moving forward with that. So I guess it's a question and an ask.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, a couple of things. First, I want us to be clear. We'll continue to be the friends of the Americans, and we will continue to have family members, friends, etc., on both sides of the border. That's just who we are as Canadians. And we should use these networks to our advantage, to tell them what we're going through and how much this will have an impact on them. And they should tell their friends, and they should tell their family members. And we need to organize. This is not a concept. This is true. This is real. That's what you're doing in your businesses every day. You're organizing yourselves to make sure that you have more clients, better market share, etc. This is political organization 101, guys. Okay, so you know a mayor, you know a friend of the governor, you just use all these networks, and you make sure that our narrative, which is you guys started this trade war. This was something that we never. We did everything to prevent, and this is hurting you back. It is important that we say that to them and that they spread the message. Really, really, really important. This may be the first time that President Trump is actually really feeling political pressure. Let's ramp up that pressure. Okay. First. Second, acts of kindness with American people coming from Canada is also just part of who we are and our nature, but also great communications. So when we help the wildfires in Los Angeles, of course, the American people, just remember, they don't have any problems with Canadians. When you look at all the polls, we're the ones that they love the most in the world. So there's no frustration towards us. They actually don't really understand why there are American tariffs against us. Let's use that. Use that capital, that friendship, to put pressure on President Trump himself. He never talked about the 51st state during his elections. He never talked about the rhetoric regarding what was going on, these tariffs against Canada. Never. Nobody was prepared for this. None of you, none of us. This came out of nowhere. Yeah. So I think showing that you can cooperate through, indeed, your employees, working with your supplies, but meanwhile, understanding that you may want to look at your supply chains, guys, and your purchasing powers to make it pro-Canadian. And this may cost a bit more, but you will be saving jobs every day. That's also a duty that you all have to do. That's definitely what we will do as a government. And with the new Prime Minister, etc., for sure we'll look at our procurement policies. That's what the Americans are doing. Yeah. Of course, that's what we'll do too. So I could go on and on and on, but I gave you 3 things concrete to act upon.
We just have time for a few more questions. Tracy, and I will come to you, Jeff. Tracy, please.
Thank you, Minister, for being here. Tracy Garrett, I'm the CEO for Aviva, which is one of Canada's biggest property and casualty insurers. We're often described as a sector as the economic shock absorber for millions of consumers and businesses across the country. And at this time of crisis, we're ready to step up and play our part. But we should be under no illusion that if the tariffs hit as proposed, it will have an impact on claims costs for those businesses and consumers across homes, properties and businesses. And that will result in premium increases for customers at a time that they can ill afford it. One of the mitigants that we can all consider, and what I've been really encouraged by in the last 2 or 3 weeks, has been a conversation about how within Canada's borders we get out of our own way and we seek to remove frictions in our own system. I would really encourage both federal and provincial governments and regulators to look at the ways and to accelerate and to be much clearer about where there could be convening authority to actually make some of that friction removal happen and happen really quickly. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that the Prime Minister has been convening also the premiers. It's not only political leadership. Like, it's easy to say, oh, the Prime Minister or the premiers are not taking care of it. Fundamentally, it is coming from these different professional groups. In French, I would say ordre professionnel, so the professional orders, like the engineers, doctors, etc., lawyers like I am, being very protectionist, or also making sure that they are willing to put some of their, interests on the table. Same for the unions. Same for, the business sector. It's not only a political issue. It is fundamentally a business and a workers' issue. So, who is ready to take that step?
Yeah, we have many ideas. We've put them forwards. We'll
Great.
keep pushing them forwards.
No, but I think this is our ha-ha moment.
Yeah.
And I come from a province which I love, but has a lot of protectionism. And sometimes so that's first. Second, sometimes in my home province of Quebec, people do much more commercial missions to New York State or to New Hampshire and, New England than actually to the Maritimes or to Ontario or to BC. That doesn't make sense, because there are different reasons for that, including the fact that sometimes because it was international trade, they had access to programs and subsidies. Like, we need to change that to make sure that there's more incentives to create these relationships. And maybe that if we talk to each other even more, we will be able to have stronger infrastructure across the country. But this is a moment of national unity. Yeah. And coming from Quebec, I'm telling you, the people that I represent in my home riding of Montreal, they're ready to embrace this Canadian journey. Yeah. And I'm super proud of that.
That's wonderful. Last question to Jeff, and then I'm going to turn to Minister to wrap it up.
Great. Thank you, Minister, for fighting for Canada. My question is actually very, very similar, because I see it as a generational opportunity to reduce some of these frictions. And,
exactly.
We walked through past the LCBO downstairs, and everybody's scraping off the California wine. And isn't it as simple as pushing to say, let's put Canadian products in there? We can't buy BC wine here, for example. And it seems that it would be a great opportunity as a first step to open some of those things up and kick the door open. So we're looking to see some of that from the administration.
Yeah, well, I think at the federal level, there will be a new Prime Minister very soon. And I think the big question will be, what's our economic plan? How can we make sure that we protect jobs while negotiating with the US, but at home? And how we can build more, invest more, address the productivity issues that we've had for years, reinforce our businesses, and make sure also that there's no hostile takeover. And we've taken steps even today to make sure that that was not the case. We have everything that countries want in the world. We have the best natural resources. We have the best critical minerals, the energy, the people. We are a peaceful place. We have, a tough weather, but it brings us together. We are very democratic. We have everything. And so, based on that, let's use our forces and let's continue for another 155 years of building prosperity in our country. And I think that this is a great opportunity for the political side and the business side to work hand in hand while we're dealing with this threat.
Minister, I'll just close. I know that Jenna made a great point about asking that business community needs information. Yeah. Minister, what can we do? We are committed Canadians like you, want to do our part, want to make sure we have a secure economic future. What can we do?
Okay, so while the negotiations are happening, our goal is to make sure that we have this process of addressing the trade issue with the US, but at the same time, any other issues that they can be presenting to us, because we just don't want to be in a kind of opening a gift with,
surprise!
Yeah, that's it. We don't want that. That's not the goal. There's too much unpredictability and chaos coming out of it, and we're trying to find a way to put things back on track, but at the same time using your levers, okay? So I just want you to know that we're at it. We're doing this. This is exactly the work that my team and I, the Prime Minister, Dom LeBlanc, his team, are doing as we speak. So it's not as if it's not important. Yes. Meanwhile, we also will have to work on what's the plan for Canada to invest in infrastructure, to invest in our new jobs, to have a strong industrial policy. And that will be also part of what is being discussed in the future elections that are coming up. What's the grand bargain here? How can we make sure that this crisis doesn't go to waste, like I mentioned? And, Michael, you were saying the government needs to focus on the economy. Absolutely. And that's where I am. The other thing is on your side what you need to do, like I mentioned a bit earlier, using all your networks, using your purchasing power as citizens, but also as business people. And fundamentally, invest in Canada. I'm calling on you to invest here. And if you're asking your questions whether you should invest elsewhere, let's have that conversation on how we can make sure that we protect our jobs here at home. I don't want you to take decisions that are actually having an impact on people here without having conversations on how we can make sure that you're staying here. That's really important. And as Canadians, I think, and as business people, this is a duty you have. And as a politician and as a leader of the government, the duty I have is to make sure that we find ways to keep jobs at home. And this is very serious. Mm-hmm. This is the challenge we have, particularly in the next 6 months. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much. Thank you all so much for today. Minister, we are so grateful for your time. Thank you so much. Thank you for all you're doing for us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. I told Nicholas.
Hello, everyone. Bonjour, tout le monde. It's a pleasure to see all of you. Is there some...
One question, one follow-up, please.
Okay. Okay, please go ahead. Oui, avec plaisir. Allô, Philippe.
Donc, si vous pouvez répondre en français et en anglais.
Pas de problème. Oui.
Donc, ce sursis de 30 jours accordé au secteur automobile, vous en pensez quoi?
Je pense qu'il y a encore des pourparlers qui ont lieu présentement avec l'administration américaine. Le président et le premier ministre se sont parlé aujourd'hui. J'ai parlé également avec le secrétaire d'État américain, Marco Rubio, et mon collègue Dominique Leblanc, ministre des Finances, a parlé avec le secrétaire au commerce, Howard Lutnick. Et il est clair que nous allons toujours négocier dans l'intérêt des Canadiens et que nous n'allons pas négocier contre nos propres intérêts. Et ça, je voulais faire en sorte que ce soit clair pour tous ceux et celles qui nous écoutent, parce que c'est pas vrai qu'on va vivre ce psychodrame à chaque 30 jours, et c'est pas vrai qu'on va juste négocier de pause en pause. Of course, conversations are continuing. The Prime Minister and the President spoke today. I also spoke with the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, a bit earlier at noon today, and the Minister of Finance, Dominique Leblanc, and the Secretary of Commerce in the U.S., Howard Lutnick, spoke together. Now, we will make sure that we continue to defend Canadians' interests in the context of this unjustifiable trade war that was launched by the U.S., and also we'll make sure that we will never negotiate against ourselves. And so we will be there to stand strong. And it's not true that we will go through this psychodrama every 30 days. So our goal is to make sure that we're having conversations to bring back much more certainty.
Donald Trump et Justin Trudeau se sont parlé, vous avez parlé à votre homologue également. Comment vont ces conversations? On a vu une publication de Donald Trump, encore une fois, qui appelle Justin Trudeau gouverneur Trudeau, qui se parle en fait avec leur prénom maintenant, Justin et Donald. Est-ce qu'on doit comprendre que ces conversations sont difficiles? Vous, votre conversation avec Marco Rubio?
Mais les conversations sont constructives, mais il y a, veut pas, bien entendu, des émotions liées au fait qu'elles sont complètement, ces tarifs-là sont complètement injustifiés. Le Canada a tout fait pour faire en sorte de prévenir l'imposition de tarifs, incluant en travaillant de bonne foi avec les Américains sur les questions liées à la frontière. On doit se rappeler que le président, présentement, a ses pouvoirs d'imposer des tarifs seulement basés sur le fait qu'il a un décret présidentiel qu'il a émis, qui démontre qu'il y a une crise de sécurité nationale à la frontière, ce qui est faux. Et donc, basé là-dessus, on pense qu'on doit continuer à renforcer la frontière, on doit continuer à travailler ensemble pour sauver des vies liées à ce fléau qui est le fentanyl. Mais fondamentalement, ce qu'on pense que le président veut, c'est beaucoup plus large que la question ultimement du fentanyl. C'est de nous affaiblir, et éventuellement, une fois qu'il nous aura affaiblis, de facto pouvoir nous annexer. C'est ce qu'il a déjà mentionné par le passé. Donc, basé là-dessus, notre objectif est de trouver des solutions diplomatiques. Et en tant que chef de la diplomatie, je vais continuer à le faire. Mais en même temps, on va continuer à défendre nos intérêts. Puis on a les yeux très grand ouvert. So, of course, there are frustrations that we have because of the fact that we think that these tariffs are completely unjustified and unjustifiable. These tariffs stem from a presidential executive order linked to the fact that there's a national security crisis at the border linked to fentanyl. And we know that this is a bogus argument. This is not true, particularly when it comes to the northern border. So based on that, we will continue, of course, to engage on the border, make sure that we can save lives against fentanyl and the scourge of fentanyl. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we stand strong and we'll never negotiate against ourselves. And I've said that many times, and I'll continue to say that. And as Canada's top diplomat, my job is, of course, to find a solution that is anchored in principles and diplomacy, but we need to make sure that there's more trust and much more predictability coming from the other side. Mm-hmm. But that's been a challenge. So the fact that the goalpost seems to change many times and that many other issues that are not linked to trade have been put on the table is definitely a challenge. And so that's why when we negotiate, we're not only looking at the issue of the border, we're not only looking at the issue of trade, we want to make sure that we bring back things much more into a box where we ultimately can be in a much more stable relationship. There's too much unpredictability and chaos coming out of the White House right now. Essentiellement, j'ai déjà un petit peu répondu à cette question-là en français, mais ce que je pourrais vous dire, c'est que notre objectif, c'est d'avoir une entente qui protège les emplois au Canada, qui fait en sorte justement qu'on peut avoir une frontière qui est sécuritaire ensemble, mais fondamentalement, les Américains n'ont pas mis sur la table que des enjeux liés au commerce entre nos deux pays. Ils sont allés beaucoup plus loin. Alors, notre objectif est de ramener les négociations un petit peu plus de façon à ce qu'on puisse avoir moins d'imprévisibilité, moins de différents enjeux qui sont mis sur la table encore et toujours, et qu'on puisse remettre ça un petit peu plus dans une boîte et un petit peu plus de confiance entre les deux pays, et surtout certainement entre les deux administrations. I won't talk for President Trump, but clearly we need to make sure that we fight for jobs, including, of course, in the fantastic auto sector. And that's the case also for the jobs in the steel sector, in the aluminum sectors, and all the different sectors across the board. But we know how much the auto sector is important to Ontario, and therefore for the country, and we'll fight for it. Mais on sait que... je ne répondrai pas pour M. Trump lui-même, le président Trump lui-même, mais ce que je peux vous dire, par contre, c'est que nous allons nous battre pour chacun des emplois, incluant dans le secteur automobile, qui est un secteur très important pour l'Ontario, mais aussi pour le reste du pays. Et on va se battre non seulement pour le secteur de l'automobile, mais pour le secteur de l'aluminium, pour le secteur de l'acier, pour tous les autres secteurs au pays, parce qu'il en va de la protection des emplois, mais aussi du fait qu'on puisse avoir une relation commerciale qui soit stable et prévisible dans le temps. Yeah.
Would you impose oil and potash export taxes over the objections of Saskatchewan and Alberta?
So the Prime Minister has been meeting also with premiers of provinces and territories, and we will make sure that we have strong national unity based on that, working with them, and no sector will be pitted against another. The goal is to make sure that we are protecting jobs in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, in Ontario, in Quebec. And more we're united, more we'll win. So, and we know that because we know that at the end of the day, the Americans will be divided because a lot of Americans will be suffering from these tariffs. We've said that time and again. We know that this will cost more for American people at the pump, more at the grocery stores, more when they buy a new house. And so in that context, we know that there are a lot of people in the US that are against these tariffs. And so more we're united and more we're explaining to the Americans how much this is affecting them as a tax on them, more we'll be able to win.
And you mentioned Ukraine earlier. How can Canada help Ukraine? What more can it do when our defense budget is relatively paltry?
Well, we've increased our defense budget. We also will continue to be one of the most important supporters of Ukraine. We've given a lot of military aid, but also financial support. When you account everything that we've done on the military side, but also on the financial side, which has helped Ukraine to build its own military production lines and its own capacity to be able to win on the battlefield. It is not true that Canadians will go through this unpredictability every 30 days. It's enough. We need to make sure that we stand strong, that we fight, that we have strong counter tariffs. And meanwhile, I'm calling on all Canadians to do their part. We need to make sure we're buying Canadian. We need to make sure also that if we're planning to have a vacation in the US, well, maybe it's time to actually have a vacation in Canada or elsewhere in the world. So there are different things we can do. But this is existential to make sure that our friends and families and everybody keeps their job. And this is something that we need to be united on, and I'm convinced we will be.
The follow-up question I have for you is that Trump now says that the Prime Minister is trying to use tariffs in the trade war to stay in power and not have an election.
Listen, Canadians know that there will be a new leader of the Liberal Party on Sunday. And then eventually in the coming days, there will be a new Prime Minister. I have no other comments on that. Thank you. On le sait tous. On le sait tous qu'il va y avoir un nouveau leader du Parti libéral qui va être élu dimanche. Et par la suite, il va y avoir un nouveau Premier ministre qui va suivre dans les jours qui viennent. Alors, je n'ai pas plus de commentaires à faire là-dessus parce que c'est l'évidence. Merci. Thank you.